When Jasmine Crockett and Zeldin sat across from each other that morning, few expected the conversation to become one of the most talked about exchanges of the week. The moment began without fanfare, no grand opening remarks, no soaring rhetoric. Crockett didn't raise her voice or deliver a dramatic monologue. Instead, she relied on something much quieter and often overlooked in the age of politics as performance substance. Asterisk from the very beginning. Her approach stood in contrast to the norm. While others often entered debates aiming to land a viral clip or a sharp insult, she treated the discussion as an opportunity to make a point that could actually stand up under scrutiny. Zeldin, known for his disciplined style and his ability to defend fiscal conservatism with confidence, came prepared to argue numbers, deficit projections, tax policy, and spending caps. Crockett, however, chose to look beyond the numbers and into the human impact those figures represented. Asterisk as Zeldin outlined his argument about government restraint, Crockett didn't interrupt. She listened closely, occasionally glancing at her notes but mostly maintaining eye contact. When it was her turn to speak, she began with a tone that was calm but firm, addressing his points directly. "Mr. Zeldin," she said, "you're absolutely right to emphasize responsibility, but I think we have to expand what responsibility means." Asterisk, it was a subtle shift, but an important one. Instead of arguing against him, she reframed the conversation entirely. She didn't dismiss his data. She added depth to it. While Zeldin cited cost-saving measures and long-term sustainability, Crockett brought up how those measures translated in real communities, how budget cuts might mean fewer teachers, fewer community health clinics, or reduced access to childcare programs. Her examples weren't random. They were drawn from recent oversight reports and testimonials from affected families. Asterisk Zeldin countered with composure. "Fiscal responsibility isn't about cutting people off," he explained. "It's about ensuring there's something left for the next generation." His point was well, but Crockett's response built on it with an almost surgical precision. "And I agree with you," she replied, "but the next generation depends on the one living right now. If people today can't afford education, healthcare, or stability, what kind of foundation are we leaving behind?" Asterisk, there was no shouting, no grandstanding, just two people engaging in the kind of conversation politics was supposed to be about. Yet what made Crockett's exchange stand out wasn't only her reasoning, but how she wielded it. She didn't rely on emotional appeals or personal jabs. She relied on data, but data with context. She quoted figures from Zeldin's own speeches, linking them back to the broader realities they represented. In doing so, she didn't just challenge his argument, she deepened it. Asterisk observers later noted how the moment illustrated a rare quality in political debate: intellectual discipline paired with empathy. Zeldin had experience defending tough fiscal positions under pressure, but even he seemed to acknowledge that Crockett's method left little room for the usual political sparring. Her focus wasn't on defeating him, but on exposing the limits of purely financial logic without compassion. And in doing so, she demonstrated that effective argument doesn't come from raising your voice, it comes from raising the level of discussion. Asterisk, as the exchange unfolded, the tone in the room shifted. What began as another partisan debate slowly turned into something that resembled an actual dialogue. Even Zeldin, often sharp in his rebuttals, found himself pausing more, weighing his responses with care. Crockett's steady tone made it clear that she wasn't looking for a gotcha moment. She was looking for understanding, even if it came through disagreement. That authenticity resonated not just with her supporters but with neutral observers who were simply tired of political theater. Asterisk by the time the committee moved on to the next speaker, the air had changed. Reporters who had expected fireworks instead found themselves writing about the quiet effectiveness of a congresswoman who didn't need theatrics to make her point. Crockett's takedown of Zeldin wasn't about humiliation or one-upmanship. It was about showing that substance, when delivered with clarity and purpose, still holds power in a space too often dominated by sound bites. Asterisk Zeldin himself, though unshaken in his principles, seemed to recognize the weight of her argument. His closing remarks reflected a tone of respect, acknowledging her perspective even as he held his ground. That acknowledgement, subtle as it was, spoke volumes. It showed that real persuasion doesn't always mean total agreement. Sometimes it means earning the respect of someone who sees the world differently. Asterisk in the end, what people remembered most about that exchange wasn't a single line or viral moment. It was the way Jasmine Crockett used reason, patience, and evidence to steer the conversation away from spectacle and back toward substance, reminding everyone watching that politics doesn't have to be a performance. It can still be a place where ideas, not egos, take center stage. Asterisk, when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward during that committee exchange, there was no flash of anger or hint of impatience in her expression. She looked calm, centered, almost disarmingly so. Across the table, Zeldin sat poised, ready with his usual sharp precision. Both had been in heated debates before. Both knew how to stand their ground. But this time, what stood out wasn't the clash of their ideas. It was how Crockett redefined what it meant to be tough. Asterisk, in political spaces, toughness is often confused with aggression, The loudest voice, the sharpest retort, the ability to dominate a discussion. Zeldin had built a reputation for being firm and articulate, a politician who could defend his ideas with unwavering confidence. Crockett's approach was different. She didn't need to overpower the conversation. She controlled it with quiet authority. Each time Zeldin made a point, she absorbed it, waited for him to finish, and then delivered her response with deliberate pacing, not to strike, but to clarify. Early in their exchange, Zeldin emphasized what he called the discipline of governance, referring to his belief that government must prioritize fiscal restraints even when it's unpopular. He argued that long-term stability often required short-term sacrifice. His delivery was composed, steady, and confident, traits that had long defined his public persona. But instead of matching his firmness with equal intensity, Crockett chose another path. She matched his discipline with composure. When she finally responded, her tone was not defensive. It was steady, even gentle, but her words carried weight. Discipline, she said, isn't just about saying no, it's also about knowing when to say yes. Sometimes responsibility requires investment in people, in opportunity, in fairness. The kind of strength that helps a nation grow isn't always about restraint. It's about balance. Her voice never rose above a conversational level, yet the room seemed too quiet as she spoke. Zeldin, accustomed to quick and decisive exchanges, listened carefully. The way she spoke left little room for interruption. It wasn't forceful in the traditional sense. It was the kind of firmness that comes from conviction rather than confrontation. Throughout the hearing, Crockett's strength showed itself in her restraint. When Zeldin pushed back, questioning her numbers and challenging her framing, she didn't flinch. She acknowledged his concerns, then calmly unpacked them, layer by layer. "You're right that budgets need boundaries," she said at one point, "but so do people. If we push citizens to their limits, expecting them to bear the brunt of cuts and reductions, where do we expect stability to come from?" It wasn't a rhetorical flourish. It was a question that landed with quiet force. Zeldin paused, not because he didn't have an answer, but because she had shifted the ground beneath the argument. Toughness, in that moment, wasn't about dismantling the other person's stance. It was about holding your own without losing your composure. Crockett's body language told the same story. No dramatic gestures, no exaggerated expressions, just a steady posture and measured eye contact. Zeldin, known for his controlled demeanor, seemed to recognize the subtle strength she displayed. While he maintained his stance, there was an almost unspoken acknowledgement between them, a recognition that true toughness wasn't about overpowering someone else, but about remaining grounded in what you believe. Observers later noted how her style contrasted with the typical tone of modern political debates, where others might have resorted to interruptions or emotional appeals. She leaned on calm persistence. Her strength didn't need validation through applause or reaction. It was self-contained. Zeldin's own measured nature made the exchange even more revealing. Both were firm in their positions, but Crockett's method illuminated a kind of leadership that doesn't need to dominate to be respected. As the conversation moved forward, it became clear that Crockett's version of tough wasn't reactive, it was reflective. She understood that tone could carry as much power as words. She didn't just defend her point, she embodied it. Her poise under pressure demonstrated that real strength often lies in refusing to be pulled into the chaos of confrontation. Even Zeldin, who continued to argue his side with conviction, seemed to adjust his rhythm in response to hers. The pace of the exchange slowed. The back and forth became more deliberate, less about outmaneuvering and more about reasoning. That subtle shift, the change in tempo, was a sign of Crockett's control. Without ever asserting dominance, she set the tone. When the hearing concluded, commentators described her demeanor as measured, strategic, even graceful, under fire. Yet those words only hinted at what had really happened. In an environment where toughness is often mistaken for hostility, Jasmine Crockett showed that composure can be its own kind of strength, one that disarms without demeaning, that persuades without provoking. Her exchange with Zeldin didn't end with a definitive victory for either side, but it left a clear impression. Toughness doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it can whisper, and still command the room. When Jasmine Crockett and Zeldin faced each other during that committee hearing, it wasn't just their differing political views that stood out. It was how they chose to engage. In a space where voices often overlap and tempers rise quickly, both managed to hold a tone that was firm but measured. Yet what truly set the exchange apart was Crockett's ability to listen, really listen, and in doing so, change the rhythm of the entire discussion. From the outset, Zeldin spoke with the precision of someone deeply familiar with fiscal policy. He presented his points about government spending with the confidence of a seasoned lawmaker, outlining why he believed in tighter budgets and long-term restraint. As he spoke, Crockett didn't interrupt. She took notes, occasionally nodding, her pen moving only when a particular phrase seemed worth revisiting. It wasn't performative, it was focused. She wanted to understand his perspective before responding. That simple act of patience made a difference. When it was her turn to speak, Crockett began by acknowledging his experience. "Mr. Zeldin," she said, "you've spent years studying the numbers, and I respect that. But I want to talk about the people behind those numbers." It was a small but powerful gesture, one that showed she had heard him, not just waited for her chance to counter. Zeldin seemed to appreciate the acknowledgement, even as he prepared for disagreement. "Of course," he replied, "policy has human consequences, but without stability, we can't sustain any of it." It was a fair point, one that echoed the concerns of many who share his view. Crockett, instead of rushing to dismantle it, built on it. "Stability," she said, "isn't just about financial security. It's also about emotional and social security, the sense people have that their government sees them, hears them, and values them." That exchange reflected something that has become increasingly rare in political conversation, a genuine dialogue. Zeldin's argument came from a place of structure, the need for order and discipline in governance. Crockett's came from empathy, the belief that systems exist to serve people, not the other way around. But rather than talking past each other, they spoke through each other's perspectives, meeting in the middle of the discussion rather than standing on opposite sides of it. Observers in the room noted the subtle change in tone as the conversation went on. Zeldin, known for his quick rebuttals, began to slow his pace. He started to respond more thoughtfully, perhaps because Crockett's attentiveness created space for reflection. She wasn't waiting to score a point, she was creating a moment of understanding. That kind of listening has a quiet power. It lowers defenses, allowing the conversation to move from confrontation to collaboration. Throughout the hearing, Crockett demonstrated that listening isn't a sign of passivity. It's a form of strategy. By letting Zeldin fully explain his reasoning, she showed respect for his expertise, and in turn, earned the room's attention when it was her turn to speak. When she eventually challenged his view, her words carried more weight, because they were rooted in what he had actually said. Her critique wasn't abstract, it was precise. At one point, Zeldin spoke passionately about the importance of accountability, saying, "Every dollar spent has to be justified. Taxpayers deserve transparency." Crockett agreed, but then added, "And accountability also means ensuring every dollar withheld is justified, too. When we decide not to invest in healthcare or education, that's a decision that deserves the same scrutiny." The exchange wasn't sharp, it was balanced. It was the kind of dialogue that forces both sides, and the audience, to think. That back and forth showed how listening can transform debate into discovery. Instead of trying to win, Crockett was trying to uncover common ground, or at least a clearer understanding of where they differed. Zeldin responded in kind, engaging with her points directly rather than sidestepping them. By the end, even those who disagreed with either one of them had to admit, it was refreshing to see disagreement handled with dignity. In that hearing room, listening became an act of leadership. It bridged ideological divides, if only for a moment, and reminded everyone watching that politics doesn't have to be a shouting match. Zeldin's discipline and Crockett's empathy met halfway, forming a dialogue built on mutual recognition. Each time one spoke, the other gave space, and that space allowed clarity to surface. The scene was almost quiet in its intensity. No grand gestures, no interruptions, no forced smiles. Just two people engaged in the work of democracy, listening, responding, thinking. For Crockett, it wasn't about softening her position. It was about strengthening it through understanding. For Zeldin, it was about being heard by someone who genuinely cared to grasp the why behind his argument. And for everyone watching, it became a rare glimpse into what real debate looks like when listening is treated not as a pause before talking, but as leadership doesn't always reveal itself in moments of triumph or authority. Sometimes, it shows up in how a person handles pressure, disagreement, and scrutiny. That's what made the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Zeldin so memorable. It wasn't about who won or lost the argument. It was about how both carried themselves while defending their convictions. For Crockett, it became a defining example of modern leadership, grounded in empathy, guided by principle, and expressed through calm confidence rather than confrontation. As the hearing began, Zeldin spoke with the assurance of someone who had spent years crafting and defending policy. He discussed fiscal responsibility with precision, pointing to what he believed were the dangers of unchecked government spending. His tone was assertive, his argument structured, and his delivery confident. Crockett listened attentively, letting him build his case without interruption. When it was her turn to respond, she didn't try to dismantle his points immediately. Instead, she began with something few expected. Acknowledgement? Mr. Zeldin, she said evenly, you've made some important points about accountability. I think we agree more than it might sound. That line alone set the tone for what followed. She wasn't conceding ground, she was establishing a shared foundation. It's a small but powerful form of leadership, creating common ground before introducing disagreement. It signaled to Zeldin, and to everyone watching, that this wasn't going to be a shouting match. It was going to be a conversation. Zeldin nodded slightly, waiting for her next words. But leadership, she continued, isn't just about holding the line, it's about knowing when to draw a new one. She went on to explain that while fiscal restraint mattered, so did compassion. The strength of a nation, she argued, came from how it balanced discipline with care. She wasn't trying to outshine Zeldin, she was trying to elevate the discussion. Zeldin, for his part, didn't back down. He countered with the argument that too much government intervention can stifle innovation and create dependency. It was a perspective he had articulated many times before, and he did so here with his usual clarity. But Crockett didn't rush to disagree. She waited, letting his words settle before responding. "I hear that concern," she said, "but I also believe government can empower not by doing everything for people, but by giving them the tools to do for themselves." That back and forth reflected something deeper than policy differences. It reflected two distinct philosophies of leadership. Zeldin represented structure, discipline, and long-term planning. The leader as a protector of systems. Crockett embodied empathy, adaptability, and inclusiveness. The leader as a bridge between systems and people. The conversation that day revealed how both forms of leadership could coexist, even within disagreement, if guided by respect. Observers later pointed out that Crockett's composure was what gave her words their power. She never raised her voice, never tried to overpower Zeldin. She simply stayed steady. That steadiness projected control, not arrogance. It made people listen, including her opponent. Zeldin, usually unwavering, found himself engaging on her terms. Her tone invited reflection rather than reaction. At one point, Zeldin remarked, "If we're not careful, compassion can become complacency." Crockett responded, "And if we're too rigid, responsibility can become neglect." It was one of those rare exchanges where two opposing ideas didn't collide, they balanced. Both were right, in their own ways. And that's what real leadership looks like, the willingness to explore truth, even when it challenges your own side. Crockett's approach in that hearing spoke to a broader kind of leadership that people have been longing to see. One that values listening as much as speaking, understanding as much as persuading. It's a leadership style that doesn't depend on dominance or spectacle. It depends on presence. She showed that being a leader isn't about commanding the room through volume, but through vision. Zeldin's presence, too, played a part in shaping that moment. His seriousness, his grasp of policy, his calm delivery, all gave the discussion weight. But Crockett's ability to humanize complex issues gave it heart. Together, they created a rare dynamic in modern politics, mutual accountability without hostility. She respected his expertise. He respected her conviction. And that mutual regard transformed the tone of the exchange. When the hearing ended, the discussion continued online. Viewers commented not only on Crockett's sharp reasoning, but also on how she embodied leadership through calmness and clarity. Many noted that Zeldin's measured demeanor complemented her approach. It was a reminder that even in disagreement, two leaders can model what respect looks like in action. Crockett's message wasn't just about policy. It was about the kind of leadership that meets conflict with grace, that chooses patience over pride, and that stands firm without standing tall over others. Zeldin's presence in that exchange gave her an opportunity to demonstrate that style of leadership, one that doesn't aim to silence opposition, but to show how listening, reasoning, and empathy can command far more authority than force ever could. As the hearing drew to a close, the air in the committee room felt noticeably different from when it had begun. What started as another tense political exchange had turned into something meaningful, a demonstration of what discourse could look like when intelligence, respect, and authenticity guided the conversation. Both Jasmine Crockett and Zeldin had stood firm in their convictions, but they had also shown that conviction does not have to come at the expense of civility. Crockett's closing remarks reflected that balance. She didn't take a victory lap, didn't claim the final word as a weapon. Instead, she left the room with a reminder. "We can debate budgets, policies, and philosophies," she said calmly. "But at the end of the day, all of us are here because we believe this country can be better. That belief should unite us more than any disagreement divides us." It was a line that resonated because it was simple, grounded in the kind of truth that cuts across ideology. Zeldin, listening intently, nodded. When he followed with his own concluding comments, there was a tone of acknowledgement in his words. He didn't retreat from his principles, but he recognized the integrity in how Crockett had approached him. "We can disagree," he said, "and still walk away respecting the process and the people behind it." It was the kind of mutual respect rarely seen in such public forums, and it spoke volumes about the character of both participants. The moment may not have changed policy, but it left an impression on those who watched. It reminded people that political strength doesn't come from domination, but from discipline, from knowing when to push, when to listen, and when to bridge. Crockett, through her calm and thoughtful style, represented a new image of leadership, one that doesn't depend on theatrics or anger, but on presence and empathy. And Zeldin, through his steady confidence and professionalism, provided the perfect counterbalance, proving that firmness can coexist with respect. As clips of the exchange made their way online, commentary followed from all sides. Some praised Crockett's poise, Others admired Zeldin's composure, but most agreed on one thing. It was refreshing to see two political figures engage without losing their humanity. The hearing became less about policy differences and more about an example, a reminder that democracy works best when dialogue replaces hostility. In an era when so many public discussions seem designed to divide, this exchange stood as a quiet reminder that unity isn't born from agreement, but from understanding. Crockett's patience, Zeldin's focus, and their shared professionalism turned a potential confrontation into a masterclass in communication. Neither had to win for both to earn respect. As the committee adjourned and the room slowly emptied, there was no applause, no outburst, just a quiet sense that something worthwhile had taken place. It wasn't dramatic or headline-grabbing in the usual way, but it was meaningful. In a time defined by noise, two leaders had chosen clarity. In a space often ruled by ego, they had chosen respect. And that, perhaps, was the real victory of